There are two aspects of humanity that can under certain circumstances come into conflict with each other and cause untold misery. But each of them are quite important aspects, quite important things that really make us what we are, that define us as human beings, and without which we simply wouldn't be the same. The first one is our tendency to be gregarious. We, human beings, do not live as solitary individuals. We live in groups, families, bands of hunter-gatherers originally, and nowadays, of course, societies, states and countries. That's how we live together. And whenever human beings in large enough numbers live together, there naturally emerges a state of hierarchy between those human beings. There is inevitably almost a ruling class. Rules are being set, even though in our Western societies they are done so democratically, they still get set by elected representatives, for example. There is still always a ruling class, and thankfully we in our Western society get some say into who that is at any point in time. But there is always a ruling elite, there's always a law-giving force, and in certain circumstances that can degenerate into a regime, a totalitarian regime, for example, or a dictatorship. The other aspect of what makes us human is our tendency to attribute motivation and to seek agents to everything around us. We tend to look at things happening spontaneously in nature, and we tend to interpret those things as the actions of an agent working from a motivation. We see something move in the corner of our eye, and our first inkling, especially when we were still living as hunter-gatherers on the savannas, would be to think, that's a predator who's looking at me and trying to eat me because it's hungry, it wants something, it wants to eat me. That is fine, and it obviously has led to an awful lot of our ancestors surviving because they ran away, for example, rather than just sitting there wondering what that rustling in the grass was. But it also leads to us looking at things like the sunrise and the sunset and thinking that this is the will of a God at work. And that, of course, then ultimately leads to things like religion. They are at least a contributing factor to those things. And this is where the two clash. When the fact that societies are ruled by a ruling class degenerates into a regime, totalitarianism, dictatorship, and it conflicts with the fact that a large majority of the population holds a particular set of religious beliefs. The problem with religious beliefs is that an awful lot of what happens in the universe around you is attributed to the will of a God, an ultimate authority that has a say into what we should do, our morality, and how we should behave. And the problem, of course, with that is that a dictatorship sees that as competition, which needs to be stamped out or subverted. And that is where there are two ways of dealing with this particular problem if you are a dictator or a regime. The first one is to turn your regime into a theocracy. Claim that your authority is directly derived from God, that you are acting out the will of God. That will lead to theocracy, and that will lead to lots of excesses. The other alternative, of course, is to try and stamp out religion, because you will not accept the authority of a God over your own if you're a dictator. And that will lead to atheistic types of ideologies, atheistic types of regimes, such as communism, for example. The problem is that an awful lot of people do not seem to understand that that is necessarily the sequence of events. The sequence of events has to start with a group of people that wants to take control over society, that wants to establish a regime, that wants to take matters into their own hands, that want to establish a dictatorship, for example. What way that goes is determined by sheer opportunism from those people. It has nothing to do with whether religion or atheism is the driving force here. It is not. It is just subverted in order to serve a particular cause. Anybody who claims that religion is responsible for excesses, such as what happens in Saudi Arabia, for example, is missing the point altogether. Religion in Saudi Arabia is simply used, abused, to justify what happens there. And similarly, atheism does not lead to things such as communism. Communism used atheism as a club to beat obedience out of the people that it tried to subjugate. Atheism is just not believing in God. Theism is just believing in God. What people do with those things is what determines whether such things become a problem. Atheism and theism themselves are not problems. They are just two slightly different ways of looking at reality. Just a thought.